Her expression never changed. Her hands remained perfectly steady as though she were simply adjusting the place setting. Leaning close enough that only he could hear, she whispered one calm sentence. "The wine was poisoned for you, sir." His hand stopped in midair. The smile that had survived hours of difficult negotiations disappeared without a trace. Across the polished mahogany dining table, 6 powerful businessmen continued discussing billion-dollar contracts, completely unaware that their secret had already been uncovered. What frightened Cho Tae was not merely the warning itself. It was the realization that the quiet young woman serving dinner had somehow discovered a conspiracy that his own security experts had failed to detect. None of the guests noticed the frozen moment. None of them realized that their carefully planned assassination had already begun to collapse. But before discovering why one quiet whisper changed everything, subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because it's always incredible to see how far these stories travel around the world. Now, let's uncover why everyone seated at that magnificent dinner believed Cho Tae would never survive the night. Texas had become home to some of America's largest business empires, but none carried more influence than the companies controlled by Cho Tae. Years earlier, the Korean billionaire had transformed a modest technology investment into a multinational empire stretching across artificial intelligence, energy infrastructure, luxury real estate, and international shipping. Competitors described him as impossible to outthink because he never reacted emotionally. Every decision appeared calculated years before anyone else recognized the opportunity. His mansion outside Dallas reflected that same philosophy. It was enormous without appearing excessive, elegant without demanding attention. Every hallway, every security camera, every carefully selected piece of artwork communicated discipline instead of extravagance. Employees often remarked that the house felt less like a palace and more like the headquarters of a man who believed preparation was the highest form of power. Loyalty mattered more than talent inside those walls. People who served faithfully remained for decades. People who betrayed trust disappeared from his professional life forever. Only 3 days earlier, a young woman named Grace had joined the household staff. She attracted little attention. Unlike employees eager to impress wealthy employers, Grace moved quietly through each room, speaking only when necessary. She listened more than she talked. She noticed details others ignored, replacing objects exactly where she had found them, and remembering routines after witnessing them only once. Several longtime employees assumed her silence came from nervousness. They were mistaken. Grace simply believed that people revealed more when they assumed no one was paying attention. On the afternoon of the dinner meeting, the mansion became unusually busy. Luxury vehicles rolled through the front gates one after another. Private security officers checked identification. Executive assistants hurried through marble corridors carrying confidential folders. The gathering had been announced as a partnership discussion involving several influential investors whose combined fortunes reached into the billions. Everything appeared ordinary, yet Grace sensed something she could not immediately explain. One guest declined water but repeatedly requested that only one specific bottle of imported wine remain unopened until Cho Tae arrived. Another executive smiled warmly whenever someone looked at him, but his fingers trembled each time conversation turned toward the evening's contract. A third guest quietly exchanged brief glances with the personal physician hired to remain on standby during the meeting, although neither acknowledged knowing the other. Individually, each detail meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. Grace continued serving without drawing attention. Cho Tae entered the dining room precisely on schedule. The conversation stopped instantly. Respect followed him naturally. He greeted each guest with calm professionalism before taking his seat at the head of the table. His voice remained steady as discussions began, asking thoughtful questions that forced every participant to defend projections, investments, and financial expectations. Hours passed. Every proposal sounded convincing. Still, Grace noticed something deeply unsettling. Whenever Cho Tae challenged a financial estimate, several guests seemed less interested in reaching an agreement than ensuring he continued drinking from the same crystal glass. Why? She quietly refilled water for another executive while listening without appearing to listen. Later, while collecting serving trays in the preparation kitchen, Grace witnessed an incident no one else appeared to notice. The imported wine bottle had briefly disappeared. When it returned, its seal looked untouched, but the label faced the opposite direction. Most people would never have recognized the difference. Grace did. Someone had carefully rotated the bottle before placing it back onto the silver serving cart. Her heartbeat quickened. She quietly examined the cork. Everything appeared perfect. Then she noticed a tiny puncture hidden beneath the decorative foil surrounding the bottle's neck. A specialized syringe could pass through such a hole without breaking the seal. The realization sent a wave of cold certainty through her. She could not accuse powerful businessmen without proof. She could not create panic. She could not alert the conspirators. Returning to the dining room, Grace maintained the same composed expression she had worn all evening. The executives remained absorbed in negotiations while Chote calmly reached for his wine. Time seemed to slow. Every heartbeat felt louder than the conversations surrounding her. She stepped behind his chair. No guest looked her way. Leaning forward just enough for her voice to disappear beneath the discussion, Grace spoke 6 words that carried the weight of a life. "The wine was poisoned for you, sir," Grace whispered. Chote's fingers froze around the crystal stem. Without lifting his eyes toward her, he understood one terrifying truth. Someone seated at his own table wanted him dead, and whoever planned it still believed their perfect crime was only seconds away. Chote did not flinch. To anyone watching across the table, his hand had merely paused for a brief moment, as though considering a point raised during the negotiations. His expression remained composed, his breathing steady, and his eyes betrayed nothing. Years spent navigating hostile boardrooms had taught him that the first person to reveal fear usually surrendered the advantage. Without acknowledging Grace, he slowly lowered the crystal glass onto its coaster. "I believe we have been speaking for quite some time," he said evenly, "before we discuss the final terms. Perhaps we should review the market projections once more." Several guests exchanged quick glances before returning polite smiles. The delay irritated them. That irritation lasted only a heartbeat before they convinced themselves nothing was wrong. Grace quietly stepped away from the table, her pulse racing beneath the calm mask she had forced herself to wear. She knew she had crossed a line no new employees should ever cross, yet remaining silent would have condemned an innocent man. Now she could do nothing except trust that Chote understood the danger. He understood perfectly. As another presentation appeared on the large screen at the end of the dining room, Chote pressed a small button beneath the edge of the table. The signal traveled silently through the mansion's private security network. No alarms sounded, no guards rushed into the room. Only one message appeared on the encrypted tablet carried by his chief of security. "Verify the wine discreetly. Nobody enters. Nobody leaves." Outside the dining room, the chief of security immediately understood that the instruction came with the highest level of urgency. 2 trusted officers quietly entered the service corridor instead of the dining room, intercepting the unopened bottle before another servant could touch it. Inside, the conversation continued as though nothing had changed. One investor enthusiastically described future profits from a proposed energy partnership. Another outlined international expansion plans. Chote listened carefully, occasionally asking precise questions that forced each speaker to reveal more information than intended. He was no longer negotiating a business agreement. He was studying suspects. Every hesitation mattered. Every glance carried meaning. Every unnecessary word became another piece of a puzzle. Across the table, one executive seemed unusually eager for the discussion to conclude. Another repeatedly checked the expensive watch on his wrist, despite pretending complete confidence. A third casually encouraged everyone to enjoy the imported wine before dessert arrived. The suggestion came too naturally. Chote smiled politely. "I prefer to finish important decisions with a clear mind," he replied. "The wine can wait." For the first time that evening, disappointment briefly crossed the man's face before he recovered with a courteous laugh. The reaction lasted less than a second. Chote noticed. So did Grace. She had resumed arranging dessert plates near the wall, careful never to stare directly at anyone. Yet years of quietly observing people had sharpened instincts that rarely failed her. She saw the same executive subtly tighten his grip on the armrest after Chote refused another sip. Someone had expected the poison to work by now. Several minutes later, the chief of security returned through a side entrance reserved for household staff. He did not approach the table. Instead, he passed behind Cho Tae while carrying a folder, appearing to deliver additional financial documents. Hidden inside was a single handwritten note. Laboratory kit confirms foreign toxin. Fast acting. Cho Tae closed the folder without changing expression. Grace had been right. Someone inside the room had attempted murder. But exposing the poison alone would never be enough. Powerful men did not destroy themselves because of one contaminated bottle. They denied, delayed, and blamed others. Whoever organized this conspiracy had certainly prepared an explanation. He needed something stronger. Evidence that connected every conspirator. Evidence impossible to dispute. Continuing the discussion, Cho Tae deliberately shifted the conversation toward internal company finances. "I've always believed successful partnerships require complete transparency," he said calmly. "Perhaps each of us should explain how today's investment will be funded." The atmosphere changed almost immediately. Confident smiles faded. One businessman hesitated before answering. Another reached for documents that suddenly seemed incomplete. A third interrupted repeatedly, steering the discussion away from financial details. Their uneasiness confirmed Cho Tae's suspicion. The murder plot was tied to money. Hidden somewhere beneath contracts and partnerships lay the true motive. Meanwhile, Grace quietly remembered something else. Earlier that afternoon, she had seen one guest speaking privately with a maintenance contractor near the mansion's surveillance control room. At the time, it had seemed insignificant. Now it no longer did. Had someone attempted to interfere with the security cameras? She carefully excused herself and entered the service hallway, where she encountered the chief of security. "There may be something else," Grace said softly. He listened without interrupting. Minutes later, technicians began checking every surveillance system inside the mansion. Most cameras functioned perfectly. One did not. The camera overlooking the private wine cellar had stopped recording for exactly 11 minutes that afternoon. Someone had erased only the precise window needed to tamper with the bottle. Instead of discouraging Cho Tae, the discovery strengthened his confidence. People who believed they had created the perfect crime often overlooked the smallest details. Those overlooked details eventually became evidence. Returning to the dining room, Grace noticed another unexpected development. One guest quietly slipped his phone beneath the table, typing a short message before locking the screen. A few seconds later, another executive's phone vibrated silently. Neither man acknowledged the exchange. Neither realized Cho Tae had seen both movements reflected in the polished silver centerpiece. The billionaire remained perfectly composed, discussing market forecasts as though nothing unusual had happened. Inside his mind, however, every observation was falling into place. The poisoned wine, the damaged surveillance recording, the secret messages, the nervous reactions, the unexplained financial hesitation. Individually, they were suspicious. Together, they formed the outline of something far larger than a simple assassination attempt. Someone had not only planned to eliminate him, someone expected to inherit everything that would collapse after his death. Cho Tae finally understood. The dinner had never been about forming a partnership. It had been designed as the final move in a carefully constructed corporate takeover. And before the night ended, he intended to discover exactly who believed they had already won. The atmosphere in the dining room remained remarkably calm. Crystal glasses still reflected the warm chandelier light. Every word spoken had been recorded. Every suspicious movement had been documented. Every attempt to manipulate the evening had become another thread in a web that was now tightening around those who had woven it. He gently closed the final contract folder and looked around the table. "I appreciate everyone making time for tonight's discussion," he said calmly. "Before we sign anything, there is one final matter that deserves our attention." The businessmen exchanged confident smiles. They believed the negotiations were finally reaching their conclusion. None of them realized the evening had already slipped beyond their control. Cho Tae nodded toward the doorway. His chief of security entered quietly, carrying a slim case. No one appeared alarmed. The security chief opened the case and carefully placed several items on the table. The imported wine bottle, the unopened laboratory testing kit, a printed forensic report. Silence settled across the room. Cho Tae folded his hands. "This bottle," he said evenly, Contains a fast-acting toxin introduced through a microscopic puncture beneath the decorative foil. The seal remained intact, making the contamination almost impossible to notice. One executive forced a nervous laugh. "That is a serious accusation," he replied. "It would be," Cho-tae answered, "if it were merely an accusation." The chief of security slid the laboratory report across the polished table. The color slowly drained from two faces. A third man reached for his glass, but stopped before touching it. Cho-tae noticed every reaction. "I chose not to drink because someone in this room cared more about my life than your plan," he continued. For the first time that evening, every eye turned toward Grace. She stood quietly near the entrance, looking neither proud nor frightened. She had simply done what her conscience demanded. One businessman quickly regained his composure. "Perhaps a servant made a mistake," he suggested. "Surely no one here would risk something so reckless." Cho-tae looked at him without anger. "I considered that possibility." He nodded once more. A large monitor at the end of the dining room illuminated. Security footage appeared. Although one camera overlooking the wine cellar had been disabled for 11 minutes, another camera from a nearby hallway had continued recording. It showed a maintenance contractor entering the restricted area. Moments later, one of the dinner guests quietly followed him inside. The timestamp matched the exact period during which the poison bottle had been altered. The room fell silent again, too. The businessman who had spoken first slowly leaned back in his chair. His confidence began to disappear. Cho-tae continued speaking with the same calm tone. The missing footage made someone believe the evidence had vanished. Another image appeared: financial transfer records, encrypted payment authorizations, offshore transactions. The money traced back through shell companies before arriving at accounts secretly controlled by two men seated at the table. The supposed partnership had never been intended to strengthen Cho-tae's empire. It had been designed to dismantle it after his death. A board member would assume temporary leadership. Stock prices would fall. Assets would be purchased through companies secretly owned by the conspirators. Billions of dollars would quietly change hands while the world believed a respected billionaire had suffered a sudden medical emergency. It had been an elegant plan, almost flawless. Cho-tae looked toward the businessman who had repeatedly encouraged him to drink. "You overlooked one detail," he said. The man swallowed. "You assumed loyalty could be purchased." His gaze shifted toward Grace. "But loyalty often comes from character, not contracts." Another guest suddenly stood. "This proves nothing," he argued. Before anyone else could respond, the chief of security calmly placed a digital recorder on the table. "It proves considerably more than you think," he said. Earlier that evening, after receiving Cho-tae's silent instruction, security officers had legally activated additional recording equipment within the private meeting room. The recorder captured whispered conversations during breaks, including discussions about insurance policies, planned stock acquisitions, and confidence that the poison would leave little evidence. The conspirators listened to their own voices. Each sentence erased another possible denial. No one spoke. No one protested. There was nothing left to dispute. Moments later, vehicles arrived outside the mansion. Federal investigators and local law enforcement officers entered, only after receiving confirmation that every piece of evidence had been secured and documented. The officers conducted themselves professionally, allowing the investigation to proceed without unnecessary drama. One by one, the conspirators were escorted from the dining room. Some lowered their heads. Others stared silently at the evidence that had destroyed years of carefully protected reputations. Within minutes, the once crowded table stood almost empty. Only Cho-tae, Grace, his chief of security, and a few trusted employees remained. The silence felt entirely different now. It no longer carried danger. It carried relief. Cho-tae slowly rose from his chair and walked toward the place where Grace stood. She lowered her eyes respectfully. "I only told you what I saw, sir," Grace said quietly. "You chose courage," Cho-tae replied. "Many people would have remained silent to protect themselves." Grace offered a humble smile. "I simply believed you deserved the truth." Cho-tae nodded thoughtfully. "Wealth builds companies," he said. "Intelligence protects them. But loyalty is what allows them to endure." Every employee present listened carefully. No one doubted the sincerity of his words. Turning toward his staff, Cho-tae continued. Tonight, one person without authority protected everyone in this house. Let this be remembered. Position does not define honor. Character does. Several longtime employees looked at Grace with newfound respect. Only days earlier, she had been the newest maid in the mansion. Now she had become the person whose quiet courage had preserved an empire. Later that evening, after investigators completed their work and the mansion finally grew still, Chote returned alone to the dining room. The chandelier continued casting warm reflections across the polished table. Hours earlier, betrayal had occupied nearly every chair. Now only silence remained. He rested one hand lightly against the back of his chair and looked across the empty room. Power, he reflected, did not belong to the loudest voice or the richest fortune. True power belonged to the person who remained calm while everyone else lost control. Behind him, Grace quietly switched off the dining room lights before leaving without expecting recognition. Chote watched the darkness settle over the table where betrayal had failed. For the first time that night, he allowed himself a small, grateful smile. Some fortunes were measured in billions. The rarest fortune of all was finding someone whose loyalty could never be bought.
If you enjoyed this story of loyalty, courage, and intelligence overcoming betrayal, don't forget to subscribe for more cinematic billionaire dramas with unforgettable twists. And before you go, tell us in the comments where you're watching from because we'd love to know which part of the world joined us for this incredible journey.